This is Chapter 4 of The First Stone. And you saw everything, Mr. Ryan? Yes, sir. After they trashed my truck, I chased all three of them until they split up. Then I followed that one. Reef slouched in a chair by his lawyer, Hank Elliott, not even looking at the crown attorney or the man on the witness stand. He longed for a drink or a joint or a line of coke, anything to make this interminable questioning more bearable. He imagined disembodied mouths moving wordlessly in space and thought briefly about his mother, craved the silence her deafness must have provided. He looked again at his watch, scowled, slouched farther in his chair. Scott Phillips, the Crown Attorney, addressed the judge. Let the record show that the witness indicated the accused Chad Kennedy. He turned back to the witness. Go on, please. He thought he lost me, but the 911 dispatcher had told me to hold back, not to let him know I was following him. I was keeping track of him so she could relay his location to the police. And when he got to the overpass, he just stood there for a minute or two, watching the traffic pass under him. Reef glanced up to see the man staring at him, shaking his head in disguise. Screw you, Reef thought. Ryan's eyes held as he continued. I had no idea what he was going to do, or I would have tried to stop him. And what exactly did he do, Mr. Ryan? Ryan turned to the Crown Attorney, disbelief underscoring his words. He took out a rock out of his pocket and threw it into oncoming traffic. A strangled sob rose from the back, but Reef didn't need to turn to guess who'd made it. Probably the woman who'd stared at him when he'd entered the courtroom. He'd seen newspaper photos of her and the man sitting beside her right after the incident. The parents of the girl in the car. Screw you too, Reef thought. He yawned louder than he intended and could feel the judge's eyes on him. Screw you most of all. He longed again for a drink or a hit or both. What happened then? Phillips asked. Ryan looked again at Reef, who recognized the I'd like to kick your glare. Bring it on, Dib. Reef telegraphed back and was satisfied when the witness looked away. The rock, Ryan responded, hit the windshield of a green Subaru. The driver lost control. Objection, Hank Elliott was on his feet. Mr. Ryan doesn't know what happened inside that car. Sustained, Judge Thomas ruled. Frowning at the Crown Attorney, she instructed. Please tell your witness not to speculate, Mr. Phillips. Ryan colored and turned to the judge. If a rock the size of a fist suddenly hit your windshield hard enough to cave the glass in, you wouldn't be thinking straight either? Elliot was on his feet again. Your Honor, he began. The judge nodded. Just tell us what you saw, Mr. Ryan. Reef made no attempt to hide the smirk that played around the edges of his mouth. He enjoyed watching its effect on the witness. Ryan glowered at him, ran a nervous hand through his hair, then began again. The Subaru swerved right as it passed under the overpass and hit a van in the lane beside her, rammed into the driver's door. The Crown Attorney moved over to 3 easels positioned near the witness stand and removed a large sheet of white cardboard from the first to reveal a poster-sized photograph. Is that the van the Subaru hit? He asked. Yes, sir, Ryan nodded. There were several audible reactions to the photograph, and even Reef was surprised by what it showed. A late-model Dodge minivan, its left front fender caved in and twisted so it nearly touched the battered driver's door. Who knew steel could crumble so easily? And then what happened? I guess you'd call it a chain reaction. The van veered to the right and hit the curb, then suddenly pulled back again. The driver must have panicked and overcorrected. Objection, sustained Mr. Ryan. Sorry, Your Honor. The van suddenly swung left and hit the Subaru. And then? Ryan pulled his eyes away from the photograph and looked out across the courtroom, and Reef could tell he was looking at the girl's parents, searching for some way to describe the scene that had unfolded below the Park Street overpass. For a moment, Reef saw the nightmare in his own head. When he pushed the images aside, nobody had died, and only the girl had got hurt. Everybody else had walked away with cuts and bruises. Reef had seen worse. Ryan was still looking out across the courtroom, and as he continued, by this time they were on the other side of the overpass. The Subaru ricocheted into the left lane and was struck by an inbound truck. Is this the truck? Phillips removed a white cardboard covering the second easel, exposing beneath it a picture of something that looked like a delivery truck, except the front end was pancaked into a tangled mass of hood and grill. Yeah, Ryan replied softly. Judge Thomas leaned toward the witness. You'll have to speak louder, Mr. Ryan. Is that the truck that struck the Subaru? Yes, Ryan took a deep breath before continuing. It spun the car around so it was facing the oncoming traffic. At least 3 more vehicles piled up before the traffic finally got stopped. And this, asked the attorney, is the Subaru that Chat Candy hit with the rock. He pulled the white cardboard off the third easel. Reef heard the girl's mother dissolve into sobs, followed by the soothing tones of a man's low voice. Angry muttering rose from several places in the courtroom, but died when the judge scowled darkly. Yes, sir, said Ryan, visibly shaken by what he saw. That's the Subaru? Reef stared at the third photograph, saw the shattered front end, saw the truck rammed up into the back seat, saw how rescue workers had to cut the door off to get the girl out, and he saw something else. He felt Ryan's eyes on him, and this time it was Reef who turned away. He looked at his watch again. How long was this going to last? Phillips nodded at the witness. Thank you, Miss Ryan. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge nodded to the defense. Your witness, Mr. Elliott. Hank Elliott got up and stood for a moment looking at the photographs displayed near the witness. He frowned. All this must have taken place in a very short time. Mr. Ryan, a matter of seconds. Are you sure about everything you saw? Ryan was clearly annoyed by the question. You ever worked with explosives? The lawyer frowned again. The way this works, Mr. Ryan, is that I ask you the questions. Now, if you'll... My work is demolition. I stay alive by paying attention to details. Elliot seemed about to say something, then thought better of it. I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor. Bigger and Jinx were waiting with Scar on the back steps of the courtroom when Reef and his lawyer came out of the building. After sitting in the air-conditioned courtroom all morning, Reef felt the late June heat hit him like a hammer. Even a breeze off the harbor hadn't diminished its intensity. It was shaping up to be a hell of a summer. Kennedy, Reef turned to see a reporter coming out the door carrying a video camera. How about giving us a statement, the reporter called. Reef was about to offer his favorite comment when Elliot shook his head. You know better than that, Peterson. The reporter sneered. He can't hide behind the Young Criminal Justice Act forever. How old are you, Kennedy? How old were you planning on getting? Growled Bigger. Moving up the steps towards the reporter, the lawyer stepped between Bigger and the reporter, whose bravado had disappeared in his face of Bigger's menacing bulk. He scowled at the group and shook his head and took his equipment back inside. Reef gave a low whistle of admiration as he high-lived Bigger. How old were you planning on getting? He echoed. That was premium, man. Bigger grinned as Jinx slapped him on the back. I wish I'd decked the little, he said. Elliot stared at them, his face a mask of incredulity. That would have been a big help, he said. There was no mistaking the scorn in his voice. Jinx looked at Reef and nodded his head toward the lawyer. What curled up his... Elliot wheeled toward Jinx, his eyes blazing. What curled up my... As you saw elegantly put it, is your attitude. That all. This is just a joke, an inconvenience. Take it easy, man, Bigger said. Reef's only 17. What can they do to him anyway? Elliot looked at the huge teenager and shook his head. They can do plenty. Haven't you seen all those reporters? What does it take for you to realize this case is very high profile? You're just lucky that the witness didn't get a good look at you and that Reef didn't name you and your friend as an accomplice in the truck vandalism. Otherwise, you'd both be sitting through your own hearings. We've been in courtrooms before, Jinx bragged. I'm sure, Elliot remarked, and I see it's done all of you a world of good. Jesus, Reef, Jinx said. Great to have this guy on your side. Elliot exploded. Haven't any of you been listening to what was said in there? Reef, Jinx, and Bigger looked at him in stony silence. Only Scar nodded. It doesn't look good, she asked. It never looked good, which is why I advised Reef to plead guilty. A paper in Elliot's pocket hummed. And the lawyer pulled it out, looked at the display, and scowled. He clicked it off and returned it to his pocket. The purpose of this hearing is to provide the judge with the relevant facts prior to sentencing. With eyewitness testimony like the kind we just heard, there was no defense. The best strategy was to admit the crime up front and hope for lenient sentence. Bigger frowned. You tell all of your clients to plead guilty? Elliot sighed. This case was over the minute the details hit the papers. Why do you think this hearing was held so quickly? He didn't wait for a reply. Pressure from the public. People have zero tolerance for young crime. Some hot lawyer you turned out to be, Jinx said. Elliot shook his head wearily. I guess you get what you pay for, he said. His legal aid status reflected in his sarcasm. He reached into another pocket and pulled out a cell phone. Look, I have a couple calls to make, Reef. I see you back inside when his recess is over. Don't keep the judge waiting. He turned and headed back up the steps and into the courthouse. No one said anything for the moment. Bigger looked down at his shoe size. 14 Nikes he'd lifted from a store display at the Halifax shopping center. Jenks had had his hands shoved deep in his pockets like he was checking for loose change. Reef stood motionless, staring at the courthouse as though seeing it for the first time. A tourist in a downtown metro. Only Scar seemed capable of movement. She drifted over to Reef, stood in front of him as if waiting. Forget him, Reef said. This will all be over in a day or two. He pulled a pack of Rothmans out his shirt pocket and tapped out a cigarette, then offered the smokes to the others. Both Jinx and Bigger took one. Scar did not. She watched as they lit up the three glowing ends of their cigarettes, like punctuation in the air. You saw those photos, she said? Twin contrails of smoke streamed from Reef's nostril as he looked at the sky. Hard not to when you're sitting front row center. Geez, man, said Bigger. The Subaru was shredded. Jinx snorted. Sounds like some kind of cereal, Subaru Shreddies. Bigger cackled and punched Jinx's shoulder. Grinning, Reef turned to see Scar's wooden face. She's still in a coma, Reef said softly. The newspapers, he hissed, then regretted it. The look on Scar's face told him she'd noticed more than the mangled metal and shattered glass. She'd seen what was all over the inside. Not red, though, like you'd expect. Everything was covered in black. Pools and streaks of it like motor oil thrown from a bad piston. From farther back in the courtroom, it would probably look like shadows, but Scar had known what it was. Who knew a person had so much of it to lose? Scar's fingers brushed Reef's arm. They don't know when she'll come out of it. He looked at Jinx and Bigger, who were trying to one-up each other with more grisly breakfast food. Obvious choices like Captain Crash or Ram Flakes were giving away to more gruesome names like shredded meat. She's our age, Reef, which is a good thing, he said, refusing to look at her. He watched Jinx and Bigger escalate their serial competition. We heal fast, but what if? He wheeled on her. Jesus, Scar, what do you want me to do? Visit her? Hold her hand? What's done is done, for sake. Ain't nothing I could do about it now, even if I wanted to, which I don't. He turned away, but no before he saw the look in her eyes, something between frustration and outright anger, and to save the world he'd never understand about her. Strangers meeting her for the first time, hell, even people who got to know her a bit would miss that about Scar. Her need to protect the underdog, to make everything right. They'd see a cool, hard-edged teenager whose slim frame emphasized her bluntness, telegraphed her refusal to take crap of anyone. He'd certainly seen that side of her the first time they'd met. 2 years ago, Reef and Jinx and Bigger in the school bleachers making fun of kids trying out for the junior girls soccer team. A bunch of Barbie dolls trying to impress Ken, a.k.a. Glenn Whiddon, Reef's phys ed teacher the previous year. He'd had more than one run-in with the athletic that year over what he called Reef's undisciplined and unsportsmanlike behavior, and Reef still enjoyed any opportunity to make Whiddon's life miserable, like watching his tryouts. He and Bigger had been laughing and cheering every time someone missed a kick or fumbled a block, and Jinx had been prancing back and forth along the sideline, intimidating the girls' awkward movements. His socks balled up and suffered under his t-shirt like adolescent breasts. Twice, Whiddon had called over to them to take a hike, and both times they'd ignored him. But it had been hard to ignore the redhead who'd appeared from nowhere and told him to shut the. At the sound of her voice, Reef had turned, expecting to see an annoyed parent or a disgruntled preseason fan. She was neither. He'd seen her around the school a few times, usually alone, kept it to herself. He'd heard she was into some heavy, that her dad had done some time for dealing drugs, and now she was muling for him. Oddly, though, she was in the accelerated program, so they'd shared no classes. He looked her up and down, appreciating the curves in all the right places, grinning at the nerve of the. "Oh, baby, ain't you a fireball?" he breathed. "Goes with the hair," said Jinx. He and Bigger began to laugh again, but Reef silenced them with a wave of his hand. He smiled boredly, but his eyes were ice. "You don't want to mess with me, Red," he warned. She smiled back. "The last guy who called me that found his nuts up his." Reef casually got to his feet, swung down off the bleachers, and stood in front of her, his chest scant inches from her face. Staring down at her, he waited for her to flinch. She didn't. It hadn't taken long for them to become friends, and then lovers, although that was off more than it was on. There were things about her that made him crazy, like that day on the soccer field standing up for Whitten. Couldn't she see what a jerk he was? Like they all were? Apparently not. Much later she would tell him it was Whitten who had encouraged her to try the accelerated program. Besides teaching phys eds and coaching soccer, he administrated the Canadians mathematics competition at the school each year, and she had entered. Not from any desire to win, or even because she liked math that much, although she was good at it. She'd nearly flunked one of her math courses, but that was because she'd missed so much time, not because she couldn't do it. She told Reef that there was something in her head that made problems unfold, helped her see inside him. He couldn't understand any of it for him. Math was a puzzle with 100 goddamn missing pieces, but he understood what drew her to Whitten's math group. It was opportunity to stay after school twice each week for the month prior to the competition. Scar was a loner who would never try out for a team, but extracurricular activity had its advantages. After-school practice meant 2 afternoons each week she wouldn't have to make a drop for her father, and she'd surprise everyone when she'd placed first in the school and third in the province. Certainly Glenn Whitten, who suddenly took a big interest in Scar. He told her it'd be a crime for her not to challenge the math mark that had kept her out of the accelerated program. In fact, he'd help her do it. Reef knew Dee just wanted to play the big hero and maybe a cop a feel in his trouble. But Scar couldn't see it. There were so many things Scar couldn't see that were Windex clear for Reef, like this about the incident. "So what do you think gonna happen?" she asked them now. Bigger looked over at them. "Aw, she'll be out the hospital in no time," he offered. "You wait and see." Scar frowned. "No, about the sentence. What do you think the judge will decide?" Reef's face twisted. "What's the worst she could do? Send me to Riverview? I've been to the correction center before, but me on probation? I ain't finished my last one yet. Move me to another foster home? Like that ain't gonna happen anyways. I already heard the Barkers talking about it. They just waiting till after the hearing to move me out." Jinx took a final drag on his cigarette, then flicked the butt into the street. It danced in the wake of a passing car, thrown off a brief shower of sparks. "No need to worry, Reef. Remember the time they got Zeus for bashing that guy with the baseball bat? Slap on the wrist." "I ain't worried," Reef replied. "Just sick and tired and sitting in the courtroom. Not like the movies, huh?" Bigger snorted. "You got that right, man. How's that judge keeping from nodding off?" Scar frowned, opened her mouth as if to say something, but at the moment the door swung open and a court clerk beckoned Reef back inside. The recess was over.